This video looks at 7 well-known rock figures or groups who have publicly disagreed with, criticized, or had tense interactions with Jack White over the years. Some of these moments were outright feuds. Others were one-off spats that nevertheless caught the press. Wherever possible, I'll stick to what's been reported or said in public interviews. Now let's count down the 7. 1. Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney represents the older guard of rock royalty, a musician who comes from the Beatles era, when career paths, songwriting rules, and studio etiquette were different. Over the years, there have been moments where established figures in that generation expressed skepticism about newer, flashier approaches to rock. Reports and quotes from that world hinted at frustration with modern provocation and publicity stunts, things that sometimes get connected to Jack White's theatrical style. That tension is less a single, explosive confrontation than a recurring generational difference. Veterans defending tradition, while younger artists push boundaries. 2. The Beatles, as an institution, legacy circle. This one is less about any single band member and more about a cultural touchstone. When contemporary artists borrow or dramatize classic pop and rock elements, guardians of that legacy sometimes bristle. In Jack White's case, conversations tied to the Beatles' broader circle and the people who curate that era's reputation occasionally sounded defensive, concerned about authenticity and the stewardship of wildly influential songs. Those reactions usually play out in interviews or magazine pieces, and they can read like disdain, even if they're really worries about preserving musical heritage. 3 were Brian Wilson and the legacy of 1960s pop masterminds. Brian Wilson and his circle have long been protective of the craft of songwriting and production. For artists who foreground rawness and minimalism, such as Jack White did early on, there can be friction with creators who prize elaborate studio techniques and layered harmony work. Where Wilson stands for meticulous studio craft, some commentators saw White's stripped-down garage aesthetic as a challenge to established notions of how records should be made, which produced sharp words from critics and custodians of that older approach. 4. Kurt Cobain contextualized historical rivalry. Kurt Cobain no longer walks the earth, but his cultural presence still appears in stories about generational change and musical authenticity. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, conversations about rawness, stage persona, and what it means to be real in rock frequently invoked Cobain-era ideals. When newer artists embrace theatricality or deliberate artifice, they sometimes draw comparisons that lead to perceived tension between that tradition and newer performers such as Jack White. It's worth saying, many of these references are retrospective. Commentators and fans read history back onto modern confrontations. 5. Always Liam Gallagher, the Britpop stance. Britpop bands in the rock revival movement had a complicated relationship with garage rock resurgence in the early 2000s. Figures tied to Oasis and similar UK acts have been blunt when describing artists they thought were posturing or borrowing too heavily from past styles. Those sharp-edged comments, sometimes delivered in interviews or on stage, create the impression of outright dislike. Where Oasis and its circle emphasized swagger and a particular kind of British rock identity, some saw White's aesthetic and media-savvy posture as cultural competition, which sparked public remarks and eyebrow-raising moments. 6. Foo Fighters, Dave Grohl, contemporary tensions among rock peers. As Jack White rose to visibility, relationships with fellow contemporary rockers had their ups and downs. Dave Grohl and the Foo Fighters embody a certain stadium rock seriousness and work ethic. Clashes with artists who favor shock, theatricality, or provocative publicity sometimes popped up in commentary and behind-the-scenes friction. A few short but pointed public lines, cold handshakes at events, or differences over performance style turned into headlines. They may not always have been full-blown feuds, but they were visible tensions among peers in the same era. 7. The Black Keys and similar modern rock duos. The Black Keys and Jack White have been compared often because both mined raw blues rock and minimalist setups in their breakthrough years. Comparisons can breed competition, and when two acts occupy similar territory, stripped-down arrangements, blues influences, and retro production, small disputes or critical remarks can feel amplified. For some in that modern rock scene, there were moments of public sniping or pointed reviews that suggested friction about who was carrying the torch and who might be leaning on image over substance.
Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon.